Hi everyone, in today's video we'll dive into Tailwind CSS grid system. I'll explain how it works and guide you step by step in using it to create responsive layout. Let us get started. First, ensure you have Tailwind CSS installed in your project. If you don't have it yet, you can use CDN for quick setup and this is how you can install Tailwind CSS without using a CDN. So just navigate to tailwindcss.com. Okay, so the documentation shows you how to install Tailwind CSS. So we are going to use Tailwind CLI. So I'll just copy these, then go to my terminal and paste. Give it some few seconds to install. So you can see it has installed and it has created tailwind.config.js. So here is where we need to do some configuration. So under content, we need to point where Tailwind will get our HTML. So here we'll say src. Src will be our folder that will contain our HTML files, and then have that. So it's the same. You can just come here, and you can copy this one and paste it there. So I can copy this, go back to my VS Code, the content, and paste it there. So this will be our folder. So I have to create that folder. So say src. So src will be our folder that will contain all HTML and JS files. So inside here, I will also create another folder called CSS, which will include all our CSS files. So inside the CSS, I will create another file called input.css. So input.css, you can go back to the documentation. You can see add the Tailwind directive to your CSS. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and then paste it here. Okay, so we have added our directives. Once we have created input.css and we have added the directive inside, so let me go back to SRS folder and then create HTML file and say grid.html. Let me create a boilerplate like that. Now we need to run this command npx tailwind css. We have this flag I, means the input. We have the input right inside CSS folder, and the input file is called input.css. So we are defining that path. It is inside CRS folder, inside CSS, and then the input will be input.css. And now we have this O flag, which means the output. We want the output to be inside SRS folder, CSS folder, and the name of the output will be output.css. And then I have flagged it with watch. That means whenever we make changes, those changes are generated automatically inside our output.css. Okay, so let me run that, click enter, and then you will see this. Okay, so you can see here output.css has been generated. So this is where all our styling classes will be. So this is what we need to include inside our template. So inside our template, let's create a link, and then under href we need to define the path of our output.css. So we'll say css and then output.css. Okay, so if I come here, let me try to say here class background red 100. So you can see Tailwind CSS class has been applied, and let's have h1 say grid system. So let's see how it looks. So you go to the live server, you can see our Tailwind CSS classes are being applied. So that is how you install your Tailwind CSS in your projects. If you don't want to do all this, you can just use CDN. You can go back to Tailwind installation. We are using now Tailwind CLI. You can decide to use CDN. All you have to do is just copy these and then place it, add the plain CDN script tag to the head of your HTML file and start using Tailwind utility classes. to style your content. So this is the quickest way to set up your Tailwind CSS, but it is not advisable more so when you are doing a large project that needs deployment. Okay, so you need to use Tailwind CLI or you post CSS, something like that. Okay, so having done that, we have now managed to set up our Tailwind CSS. The next thing now we need to do, let us understand our Tailwind CSS grid system. Tailwind's grid system is super flexible. Here are some key concepts that I want you to learn. The grid enables the grid layout. You know how the grid looks like. And then we have the grid calls, which defines the number of columns in the grid, and then we will have the gap, which adds spacing between grid items, and we have grid rows, which will define the number of rows. These you can easily create layouts that adapt to different screen sizes. So let's give it an example. So let's start with a basic grid layout with 3-column grid and some sample content. Okay, so let me delete this. Let me now do an example on how grid works. So we want to create a grid with 3 columns. Okay, so let's define first div class, and then let us have 3 div class representing 3 columns. So we'll have div and say column 1, and have another div to represent column 2, and have another div to represent column 3. Before applying Tailwind CSS grid system, let's see how it looks. So this is how it looks. We haven't applied Tailwind CSS grid system. So once we applied it, we'll have column 1, column 2, and then column 3. Now let us see a grid system in action. To create that 3-column grid layout, first thing you need to start with is class, and then that class will be grid. Okay, Tailwind CSS uses classes, so grid, and now define the number of grid columns that you want. So we'll say grid calls, and then specify the number, which will be 3, and then we need to have the gap between the items, grid items. So we'll say gap. We want a gap of 4, so that is 4 pixels, and let us have a padding of 8. If we go back and see, you can see we have grid 1, grid 2, grid 3, and you can see there is spacing. So let's see the spacing. So to be able to see the space, the gaps between the items, let us have the background for each column to be different. So class. So to add any color in Tailwind CSS, all you have to say background. Let's say we want blue, and then we say something like 500, and you supply in the number. And then let's add a background for column 2 as well. Say background red, say 400, and then let us have another column background. Okay, so it will be class background, let's say green 400. Okay, so if we go back and see how it looks, you can see we have this, and you can see we have this gap in between the grid items. Okay, so that is the work of this gap. And then we have padding of 8. So padding of 8, that means padding top 8 pixel, padding left 8 pixel, padding left right 8 pixel, and then padding bottom will be 8 pixel. And as well, you can do padding on one side, like padding top, you can say PT 8, or padding on x-axis or padding on y-axis. And then now let us center. You can see the text is at the start of the item, so let us center this text. To center the text in Tailwind CSS, it is very simple. To center the text is very simple. You have to say is text center, and then we have text. Let's center it, text center, as well as in column 3. So we say text center. So if we go back, we can see our text has been centered. Okay, we can change the color and the font size of this text. So to do that, all we have to say, let's say text, can say text white, and then we can say font. We can bold that font, say font bold. So if we go back here, you can see we have text white and all that. So let me explain how we have managed to come up with this grid. So first we have this grid class which enables grid layout, and then we have these grid calls and then the number of columns which defines 3 columns. If you want 4 columns, all you have to do is change this number here, and then you will have 4 columns. And then we have a gap of 4 which adds space between the items. You can see here we have the space between column 1 and column 2. We have this space, so that is the work of gap. So you can see they are spaced equally. Let's see the responsiveness and see if they are less responsive in smaller screens at this stage. You can see they are not that responsive in smaller screens. Now the next thing we are going to do is create responsiveness of these grids. So now let's make this layout responsive. Tailwind provides responsive utilities like SM, MD, LG, and XL to define the breakpoints. So SM stands for small screens, MD medium screens, LG stands for large screens, and XL stands for extra large screens. So let us make these responsive for smaller screens, larger screens, and so forth. So to do that, we need to start with smaller screens. So we can say, let's say in smallest screens, we want to have 1 column, and then in SM screens, we want to have 2 columns. We'll say grid calls 2. And then in large screens, we want to have 3 columns. So we'll say grid calls 3, and then we will maintain the gap and everything. Okay. So basically grid calls 1. Okay. So Tailwind CSS is mobile first. It has that mobile first approach. So grid calls the 1 is for mobile devices. That means we will have that one column in mobile devices. In small screens, we want to have 2 columns, and then in large screens, we want to have 3 columns. Okay. So for screens more than 640 pixel, we will have and for screens with 640 pixels, we will have 2 columns, and then for grids, for screens more than 1024 pixel, which is in large screens, we will have 3 columns. So let's see how it looks. So let me refresh this, and then let us inspect. You can see in mobile phones, this is how it will look. And then in small screens, we'll share these two. And then if I keep on resizing, you can see it is highly responsive. So now the last thing that we need to do is aligning and positioning content. Okay, aligning and positioning content. Now Tailwind makes it easy to align and position content within the grid. Let's add vertical alignment using place item center. So you can do that by saying first of all, we need to have the screen size. So we'll say H equals to screen. So this one will take the screen viewport, and then let's place items center. Okay, so place items center here. So place items center this class centers content both vertically and horizontally. And then we have this H screen. This one sets the height of the grid container to the full viewport height. Okay, so you can see we have that. So you can as well decide to combine, let's see, the responsiveness will remain the same. Yes, can actually see. So you can see the division. So let me remove this. Yes. So you can see it is taking the height of the viewport. So that is the function of H screen. Take the height of the to set the height of the grid container to the full viewport height. The last part I want to show you is combining grids with nested layout. So let's create a more complex layout by nesting grids. So for example, we can have a grid of 2 columns, okay, on one side, and another a grid of 2 columns on the other side. Okay, so let me delete this so that I can show you. For example, you can have something like a blog which has a sidebar, and the other part has a blog post, and then the other side has a sidebar. So let's create something like that. You start with a div, and then you define, you say another div. Inside this div, let's have a h2 in section, and then under that main section we need to have another div. So under this div we will have 2 columns as well. So we'll have div and say sub item 1, and then there we'll have another div and say sub item 2, and then here we will have another div for the sidebar. So we'll say div sidebar. We are using grid. As always, you start with class grid. We are having two columns. We will have these as first column, and then we will have this second column, and then the first column has some columns inside. Okay, so we'll have grid and say grid calls 2. Okay, and let us have a gap of 6, and let us have a padding of 8. Let's have a class here and say background blue, say 500, and then let us have a text white. Let us center the text, so text center. Let's have a padding of 4. We have this the first column. Now let us style the second column, which is the sidebar. Class, say background yellow 500, have a text white, and then let us center the text, so text center. Let's have a padding of 4. So let us go and see how it looks. So far you can see we have this will be our sidebar, and this will be the first column, and this will be the second column, and inside this first column we will have another columns inside. So let's go back. Now we have this. So here now we want to have 2 columns, so we'll say class grid, and then we need to have 2 columns. We'll say grid calls. Let's have a gap of it to be 2, and then margin top to be 4. So margin top, that means having some space at the top in outer part. In sub item, let's have a background of green 500. So plus background green 500, and let us have a padding of 2. Let's have a class as well, background red, so that we can see the changes. Let's say 500, and then have a padding of 2. So let's see how it looks. Red is not showing. Let me see why. Background red, padding of 2. So you can see. So we have nested some of the grid. We have the outer grid system of 2 columns, and in one column we also have other columns inside. So we are using nested. We are combining grids with nested layout. Let's see the responsiveness. It is not that responsive. We will make it responsive. To make it responsive, we apply the same rule that we applied in the earlier example, using screen breakpoints. So here, let's say in mobile devices, we want it to have one column, and then in smaller screens, we want to have grid columns of 2. Grid calls 2. So if we go back here and then try to, you can see now we have this looking nicely. So if I resize, you can see it is responsive so far. Okay, you can apply these the same trick for these 2 columns. You can decide for mobile devices they should have one, and then for larger screens have two. We can do the same for that. So we can come here and say mobile devices, let's have one column, and then in smaller screens, let's have grid calls. Grid columns, we need to have two. Okay, so you can see we have styled that as well. We have made it responsive, you can see. So nested grid. So you can see nested grid in the main section, and we have sidebar. Then main section contains two columns of its own two-column grid. So you can see we have two columns, column 1, and then gap of 6 and gap of 2 allow different spacing between parent and that is how you use Tailwind CSS grid system to ensure responsive layout. Whether you are building a simple or complex designs, the grid makes it easy to structure your content beautifully. Give it a try in your next project. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tutorials. See you in the next video.